Chapter 9. Psychosis is commonplace. As a consequence of our capacity for self-awareness, demanding a supportive belief system in order for humans to avoid mentally crippling existential angst, most people suffer from some kind of mental illness without realizing it. That is to say, their minds experience a break with reality. The illness can be due to disorders stemming from individual problems during brain development, which is permanent. But the more common type of psychosis is a result of adherence to an irrational belief system such as a religion or political ideology, which is not evidence-based and causes a large amount of distress for the individual as they are constantly forced to face reality and engage in irrational methods of cognitive reducing to maintain the irrational beliefs they have developed. Fortunately, this latter kind of psychosis brought on by irrational kinds of cognitive reduction is reversible because people can be made consciously aware of their break with reality and thus overcome the psychosis on their own. This type is called a delusion, and it is the most common kind of psychosis. The former kind of psychosis, which results from neurological problems, is much harder to treat and can only be accomplished with pharmaceuticals designed to resolve these communication issues between the regions of the brain so that normal human ability to perceive reality is re-established. Both types of psychosis require some kind of injection of new information to the individual in order to intervene and begin the process of ending the psychosis. This is why therapy allows a person to work through the delusion and recognize the break from reality. Debate is a typical form of information injection. But debate can be uncomfortable for many people because they are forced to defend the rationality of their irrational ideas and provide evidence to support the conclusions they draw on a topic. These people struggle in a disagreement because they view attacks on their ideologies as attacks on themselves, because they make the mistake of connecting their personal value to the accuracy of the beliefs they hold. This causes the stress of cognitive dissonance when they are faced with the realization they hold contradictory ideas due to the introduction of new information that exposes the contradictions. This unfortunately is a result of people being more interested in maintaining the illusion of being correct than in whether their beliefs are accurate perspectives of reality. Thus, the discomfort of cognitive dissonance often leads these people to create echo chambers and react with hostility to the source of new information, which is usually a person exposing the contradictions. This is misguided. The sheer fact a person is suffering from significant stress as a result of the new information proves the belief is incorrect, because cognitive dissonance is a result of internal awareness of contradictions in beliefs. Therefore, a strong and passionate belief in a deity or higher power, to the point where it impairs a person's ability to make conscientious decisions about common sense matters, should be classified as a kind of mental illness in that it is at least a condition creating a powerful delusion. The religious views of these individuals often result in them becoming very disconnected from reality. It is a kind of psychosis that causes people to suffer from anxiety, emotional distress, hallucinations, and paranoia, and it is treatable through an education in logic and science, as my opinion that psychosis is very common among the population is at odds with mainstream psychology of my time. I should remind the reader that a delusion is a type of psychosis, which is a loss of contact with reality. This is the exact same definition of what a mental illness is, and yet mainstream psychologists often pretend there is a difference between religious beliefs and mental illness. I have read the works of many psychologists who will go to great lengths to create definitions that invent exceptions for their personally held religious beliefs. Yet these definitions have no basis in reality and are very contradictory. This makes these psychologists non-objective, and their deductions about whether religious beliefs can be a mental illness are therefore unreliable. The only real difference between the labels is that what is and isn't regarded as mental illness within the field of psychology is defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, which is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. The vast majority of psychologists in this organization happen to be Christians, which makes the field of psychology rather ironic when you think about it. Essentially, the field of psychology is fielded by people suffering from one kind of psychosis who are passing judgment on people who suffer from other kinds of psychosis. Now, there are some psychologists who will adamantly refuse to acknowledge that religious ideas, delusions, and mental illness can be the same thing. For example, there are those who try to define a delusion as separate from a cultural or religious idea, even though all of these ideas are contrary to reality. They insist delusions can only be defined as those thoughts which are clearly false and cannot be accounted for by the person's cultural or religious background, nor their level of intelligence. But how does this definition make sense? Objectively, it does not. The psychologist has instead made great effort to excuse religious and cultural beliefs as being different than a delusion, even though there is no explanation given for why that kind of non-real belief is different. What objective reason is there to make such a distinction? People hold on to tightly held religious beliefs like the ability to survive lethal snake bites or pray cancer away, or that a prophet is going to resurrect after death, in the same way that an individual holds onto a delusion of an imaginary friend, or that shape-shifting lizard people walk among us. How can anyone honestly suggest these clearly false ideas are not a delusion only because a group of people share the belief in the false idea? We know superstitious ideas are not true. They are beliefs directly at odds with observable reality, and that is precisely what delusions are: a break from reality. The only factor these psychologists use to define what are and are not delusions is if the idea is popular. That is, they excuse a deeply held false idea from being labeled a delusion solely because the idea is popular. But that is an absurd distinction to make, because the number of people who share your delusion does not make the delusion more legitimate or provide any rational justification for why someone should be permitted to believe it. Thus, the definition of delusion expressed by these psychologists is a definition that is produced specifically to allow religious ideas to not be defined as a delusion. It has no other explanation and can therefore be ignored because the definition was produced as a result of intellectual dishonesty. Whether you talk to Jesus or your imaginary friend Bob, a delusion is a delusion. The popularity of a delusion does not excuse it from being labeled a delusion, and all delusions are a kind of psychosis because the belief is a result of a mental break from reality. Another psychological process related to mysticism is anthropomorphism, the tendency to apply human-like traits to non-human entities or concepts. As an example, Christians apply anthropomorphism to the universe to imagine a human-like entity called God. In another common example, the belief that dogs and cats understand human speech is another common example of anthropomorphism which people frequently engage in, as while dogs and cats can be trained to perform simple actions in response to a simple voice command. They do not truly understand the complexity of human language, as they are utterly lacking in the critical brain regions humans possess that enable us to understand language. Anthropomorphism can be motivated by loneliness or the need to predict and control our environment. It is a form of pattern seeking in which we seek to find another coherent mind where one does not exist. Another common psychological human process that leads to delusional thinking is teleological reasoning, which is the assumption that there is inherent purpose in objects or events. While many things and events have a purpose, such as chairs and birthdays, these things have purposes because humans have created them to serve a purpose. There are many things in the world which do not exist to serve a purpose in a person's life, such as rainstorms, earthquakes, or the Grand Canyon. Yet when a person engages in teleological reasoning, they prescribe an intrinsic purpose to events and things which objectively do not have them. Believing that everything happens for a reason is a belief based on teleological reasoning, as is a belief in karma. The idea that the universe will punish people for offenses they make through non-related events and situations. Karma is a delusion. Astrology is similar in this respect, as it is merely another kind of teleological reasoning. The position of planets and stars in outer space play no role whatsoever in the trivial events of an individual's life here on Earth. Although the natural forces of the universe, such as gravity and light, can have an impact in their respective ways, in detailed matters that involve humans, an examination of the universe does not always provide a reason for things transpiring the way they do. Thus it is that magical thinking like, the deity must have a reason for causing this horrible event, is a form of unhealthy teleological reasoning combined with anthropomorphizing the universe. It distracts a person from seeing the actual causes for the events in their life, and then finding ways to improve the situation. To be clear, teleological principles applied to human constructs like tools, laws, and actions is to be expected. The problem is when we apply teleological thinking to everything in reality. Although humans may be able to find benefit in anything, everything in reality does not exist to benefit humans. Teleological thinking can lead to an extreme form of optimistic thinking. These belief structures are sometimes known as positive thinking. Such philosophies are full of contradictions, and adopting these beliefs without question can only lead to cognitive dissonance. The solution to all of the complicated problems in our lives cannot be summarized into a few simple maxims that can be easily memorized. The best solutions require objectivity and critical thinking. Excessive optimistic thinking often leads to perfectionism, which is where a person forms self-value based purely on their success at certain tasks and goals. Perfectionism applied to goals that defy a person's constraints of ability. Those goals which are unobtainable causes extreme mental anguish for the individual who cannot reconcile the stress of cognitive dissonance brought on by the reality of failing to achieve goals. This leads to the psychosis of depression, which is why excessively optimistic thinking is very unwise. It is healthier that a person should accept failures and learn from them, and use the lessons in future pursuits of achievement. They should not measure self-value only in terms of success and failure in isolated cases. Instead, we should accept that failure is a possible result of any endeavor, and use failure as an opportunity to learn how to succeed in the future. Sadism is another common psychosis. Sadism is the deriving of pleasure from the infliction of physical and psychological pain onto others. While there are many sadists who are able to control themselves and refrain from inflicting serious harm because they know it is morally wrong, there are other sadists with low impulse control who stalk others and capture them so they can be tortured. Those who are sadists should be cautious of this mental wall they scratch at. Sadism combined with narcissism and a reckless disregard for the rights of others is how a person becomes a serial murderer. Masochism is a psychosis related to sadism, which is to gain pleasure from receiving pain and humiliation. It can lead to habits that are extremely dangerous for the masochist, and even cause them to become a victim of a narcissistic sadist with no regard for anyone. There are other kinds of psychosis in the world beyond what I have mentioned, but for the purpose of this section, I believe I have illustrated my point. Responding to the stress of cognitive dissonance with unhelpful kinds of mental reduction leads to psychoses that encourage more self-destructive behaviors.